Welcome to everyone who's joined us today. We're going to allow just a few more minutes for folks to continue to join us from around our country and from around the world. It's hard to believe that this is the National Mass Violence Center's 15th National Town Hall. And we are so grateful for the thousands of folks who've joined us since our inaugural town hall that began in February of 2022. Today, we have 500 registrants from 49 states and Washington, D.C. We have persons represented from 3 countries around the world: Canada, Norway, and Portugal. So I'm saying good morning, good afternoon, and good day to everyone. Over half of the persons who registered are VPs or victim service professionals, victim advocates, and we have professionals from the mental health, emergency planning and management, and school backgrounds. 58% of our registrants are in communities that have experienced a mass violence incident, and 52% of those have professionally responded to mass violence incidents, while 19% have been personally affected by an incident of mass violence. Today, we welcome you on a very special day in our field, the National Day of Remembrance for Murder Victims, and to our National Town Hall that addressed a topic that is near and dear to all of us, and that is the impact of mass violence incidents on family survivors of homicide victims and resources to assist them. As always, we extend our deep felt thanks to the U.S. Department of Justice, Office for Victims of Crime, for its support of the National Mass Violence Center and for our National Town Hall series. Just a few housekeeping announcements that I want to make you aware of. The National Town Hall is being recorded and has live ASL interpretation. Closed captioning is available to attendees. Please go to the bottom of your settings at the bottom of your screen, turn on closed captions, and you'll find that it's available in multiple languages. After being posted to our website, the recording and the slide deck and all of the resources will be available for you to download at the address listed here, nmvbrc.org. And if you're joining us by phone, please email us with your full name and address so that you will receive credit for attending. Our thanks to many of you who sent us questions about to our presenters that we could ask in advance. We will save time at the end to answer most of those questions for you. We have 4 learning objectives today. 1, we're going to talk about homicide traumatic loss and its mental health outcomes and models of grief that can be complicated by trauma. 2, we're going to identify the critical role of funeral directors and morticians in providing coordinated support and services to surviving family members. Number 3, we'll describe victim survivor services that surviving family members often need, including sensitive, trauma-informed death notifications. And finally, we will talk about among our presenters, they will identify effective strategies to honor the legacy of those killed in mass violence incidents, always remembering what has been lost. Today, we have 3 wonderful speakers, each of whom has lived experiences in working with homicide family survivors and responding to mass violence incidents. And important professional and personal perspectives about identifying and addressing the needs of victims and survivors whose loved ones were murdered in a mass violence incident. So my introductions are going to be very brief because you'll get a chance to find out a little bit more about them. I am a Dr. Alyssa Reingold is the director of our Center's Response, Recovery, and Resilience Director, and she brings decades of experience in working with families of homicide victims. Vanessa Lopez is a funeral director in Brooklyn, New York, and represents an important ally of the International Funeral Services of New York. Dr. Deborah Howard Burton is a retired law enforcement victim advocate from Broward County, Florida, is a longtime NOVA crisis responder and a consultant to our center. And finally, we are so very grateful for our two ASL English interpreters today, Gage Rodriguez and Courtney Workman. I am honored to be your moderator today. I'm Dr. Julia Sands Bell, and I'm a research instructor and on the faculty at the National Mass Violence Center with a lot of experience, a lot of years of experience in working with crime victims, both at the local and national level. And I've had the opportunity to work with our speakers and to know them and to meet others today that you will also get an opportunity to meet. I know that you're going to find them very inspiring, and this is going to be an exceptional training experience. First, we always try to begin with the voice of our victims and our families. So I want you to listen to the power of a personal story from Liz Seal. And Liz's story will set the tone for the work that we'll do today.
Hi, I'm Liz Seal. My husband, Josh Seal, is one of the 18 victims from the October 25th, 2023 Lewiston, Maine mass shooting. The National Day of Remembrance for Murder Victims on September 25th means so much to me. When Josh was killed, my world was shattered. There are no words to fully describe the pain of losing him and the hole it left in my family's life. This day matters because it tells families like mine, you are not forgotten. Your loved one's life mattered, and their story will continue to be carried forward. It gives us a moment to come together, to remember, and to honor not just the lives we lost, but the love and the light they brought into the world. For me, remembering Josh on this day is a way of saying, I carry you with me always. And I know that across the country, other families are carrying their loved ones too. Together, even in our grief, we are not alone.
We are so grateful for Liz for joining us through that recorded video to share her story and the story about her wonderful husband, Josh, and the fact that she carries him still on this important day and all others in her heart. Thank you so much, Liz, for sharing your experience. We are very grateful for the support we've received for this town hall from our friends at the National Organization of Parents of Murdered Children, known as POMC. And it was founded in 1978 by Robert and Charlotte Hullinger, following the murder of their 19-year-old daughter, Lisa. POMC provides the ongoing emotional support needed to help parents and others facilitate the reconstruction of a new life and to promote a healthy resolution. As I mentioned earlier, September 25th, every year is the National Day of Remembrance for Murder Victims, which POMC spearheaded in Congress with Congressional Senate and House resolution in 2007. And here you see photos of POMC's 2025 National Conference and the annual unveiling of their murder wall. My colleague, Dr. Alyssa Weingold, will start our discussion today with an overview of the impact of traumatic bereavement and interventions to foster support. Alyssa?
Thank you, Aurelia. I just want to kind of start off by talking a little bit about what makes homicide and mass violence a little different from other types of loss. And before we kind of talk a little bit about that, I just want to clarify terminology. When I talk about, I'm going to use the term homicide survivor. And what I mean by a homicide survivor is I mean anybody whose loved one, family or friend or loved one was killed by homicide or murder. And other folks sometimes use the term co-victim to describe that individual. But for today, I'm just going to use the word homicide survivor. So I just wanted to clarify that a little bit. Different people use different terminology. So some of the things that makes homicide and mass violence different from other types of loss includes sort of the sudden nature of the death, as well as the violent nature. These types of loss, there is that volition, sort of the intent of another human being harming and killing one's loved one. Sometimes homicide comes with the stigma of murder, and that can complicate our response and our bereavement. Homicide, especially mass violence homicide, there's usually a lot of media attention and a lot of public view, and the experience of grief and loss is a very private experience, and having that additional layer of publicity and media, both in traditional media settings and in social media settings, can definitely complicate that grief journey in the aftermath. The criminal justice system plays a big role often in some mass violence incidents and the experience of traumatic bereavement, especially if the perpetrator is caught and is going through that criminal justice proceedings. And the timing of that can sometimes overlay and complicate kind of how we're working through our grief journey, especially if that criminal justice process is very delayed. And so that can make this a little bit different than other types of traumatic loss. Having sudden financial stressors can be complicated after a sudden and traumatic loss. Homicide, and especially mass violence for some individuals, can impact their faith. It can have them questioning their faith, or sometimes they can lean in more to their faith. And so that sometimes can be a struggle for some people. And we'll talk a little bit about this, that it can increase our fear, it can increase our sense of vulnerability, sometimes increase other reactions and emotions like anger. And then sometimes mass violence and homicide is such a unique type of traumatic loss that sometimes it's a struggle for folks to connect with professionals who they feel like understand what they're going through. And that can be add an additional layer of complexity. And then the other piece, as it relates to mass violence, is we have individual loss, right? When somebody's loved one is killed or murdered. When it comes to mass violence, there's also this collective trauma and the collective loss of multiple people, perhaps whose loved ones have been killed in one incident and have that shared collective experience. However, they're all experiencing it in very different ways. And so that sometimes can be a challenge as people kind of move along their grief journey. So grief is actually a universal experience, right? It is a normal reaction to the death of a loved one. It is personal. And so how I might experience grief might be very different how you might experience grief. So there's not sort of one right, and I say right in quotes, way to grieve. Everybody differs in how they may experience that. And I usually tell folks, as long as they don't intend to harm themselves or someone else, especially early on in that first year, all feelings are normal and common, and okay after loss in such a tragic way. I do want to highlight a couple terminology because sometimes they get used interchangeably, but they are a little bit unique and different. The term loss really could mean the loss of any different type of various domains in our life. So it could mean the loss of someone, such as through death. It could also mean the loss of something else, another domain. Uh, Job, house, relationship. And so sometimes we can have those different types of losses. When it comes to the death of a loved one, the term bereavement is usually held especially for that. That's the situation of having lost someone significant through death. We usually use bereavement to describe just that type of significant loss. Grief, however, can be used to describe grieving. That's our reaction to loss. And that's it's not one symptom or one emotion. It's a constellation of different types of cognitive, psychological, physical reactions. But we can grieve the death of a loved one, and we can grieve other things, other types of losses. So grief can be used interchangeably. And then mourning. Mourning is our expression of grief. And that's usually mediated by, our upbringing, our family, other sort of social community factors that can impact how I might display my grief. And that can vary from person to person, family to family, community to community. Although grief is a universal experience, we will all, if we loved somebody, we will all at some point experience grief and bereavement in our life. And although that is universal, it actually could still make us at risk for some types of struggles in the aftermath. And so it can increase our risk for medical complications. It can increase our risk for substance use. It can increase our risk for health service utilizations. People are more likely to utilize health services in the aftermath of the death of a loved one. It increases our risk behaviors. It can increase mental health struggles in the aftermath, and it can even increase suicide as well as death from medical complications. So although it is universal, we all will potentially experience this at some point in our life. It can still increase risk for how it might impact our body and our mind. And traumatic loss or traumatic death especially can increase risk. So I just want to highlight and kind of set the stage on sort of what, and I have in quotes, common grieving, because again, there is no universal way we all are to grieve. There's no normal, but there are, some research that looks at like what can we sometimes see, and so we often will see thoughts and memories of our loved one being pretty prominent, especially early after death. We usually have a lot of disbelief, a lot of depressed mood, yearning early on, and we tend to see that may gradually decrease over time, usually over the course of perhaps 2 years. And in sort of the loss of a loved one by natural causes, not traumatic nature, we tend to see after 6 months, people tend to see more of an acceptance of loss. And perhaps that might look like kind of recognizing and acknowledging that that death is permanent, start to perhaps find moments of meaning and purpose in life, maybe start to maintain some emotional connections or reestablish connections. However, there's a little less literature or research on traumatic death and the impact on that on our grief process. And the current literature says that it's actually more extended. 1 to 2 years out, we might start to have that sense of acceptance of loss and engaging in life. Now, this varies from person to person, but just want to highlight that traumatic nature can exacerbate or extend that kind of grieving process. Now, as I mentioned, grief is not a symptom itself. It's not its own reaction, but there's a whole host of reactions one can experience when they are grieving. They can be emotional, feelings and reactions like sadness, anger, guilt, fear, even sometimes relief for some individuals, or anxiety. And we can have all those at once, and they can pinball around. Some people experience physical symptoms of grief, like tightness in our chest or stomach aches. And we often see kids tend to kind of report more physical symptoms, and they might report emotional symptoms after the death of a loved one. We might have what are cognitive symptoms, like our thoughts, and might change our worldview, especially after mass violence, of safety and who we are, and people around us. It can impact our concentration, even our memory. We might even have images of our loved one at times. Those are all kind of very typical kind of grief type of reactions. And we can also have some spiritual symptoms. We can question our beliefs, perhaps. We might withdraw from faith, or we might be comforted from faith. All of those very common types of reactions. And I want to highlight, often trauma, we use the word trauma cues or trauma reminders that somebody might experience after a traumatic or potentially traumatic event. And I just want to highlight this term. It was coined by Terry Rando, called STUG reactions, or sudden temporary upsurges of grief. And it's similar to a trauma cue that might cue a trauma. A STUG reaction is when we might have a surge of grief that might kind of bring up out of the blue. Perhaps it's a song that reminds us of our loved one, and it might bring up emotions of sadness and yearning. Or trauma cue might bring up more fear and anxiety. A STUG reaction might be that grief cue might bring up those types of feelings. And early on after loss, we can have a lot of STUG moments, and they can be very intense. And over time, they may become a little bit more spread out. They might become less intense, but we might still always have them in our life. And they can have ripple effects in how we react. So sometimes understanding what those are can be helpful for us as we learn to kind of carry that grief. So I know a lot of folks have heard the term stages of change. Or not stages of change, I'm sorry, stages of grief. So, Kubler-Ross coined the term stages of grief to try to explain. Actually, she originally attempted to explain people's stages with grief if they have a diagnosis themselves that they are going to die, and kind of what that might be like for someone going through and accepting that process. And then it kind of got used broadly to trying to describe what people might go through when they are experiencing grief. And, I think most people have heard of, denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. However, we know now from research in the literature that we don't grieve in stages. We don't, and Kubler-Ross would probably say we don't grieve in linear stages. We don't move from denial to anger to bargaining. We don't have to experience all those different emotions. And the literature kind of shows that we don't necessarily do that, although it's still used a lot in our common day language. But there is not as much evidence to support that. Some of the more newer models that exist out there to better understand grief, one of which is the dual process model of grief that was developed about 15 years ago by Strobe and Shute. And that is a model that describes how, as grievers, we engage in sort of a process of confronting and avoiding at the same time grief-related stimuli. So and that we kind of oscillate between what's called sort of loss-oriented work and restoration-oriented work. And both are really important as we move along our grief journey. And it's imperative we have both. So that working on that grief work, tending to that loss piece, and then also figuring out how we re-engage and restore living and attending to life changes. And sometimes we can get stuck in one of those two areas. If we get stuck too much in loss-oriented work, we might struggle and have a lot of sadness. Sometimes we can, as a way to cope, we avoid loss and we avoid those painful thoughts and feelings, and we could get stuck in restoration-oriented work. And then that sometimes can cause additional problems as that we're avoiding some of those pain, and that can extend our suffering. There is also the meaning-making model by Bob Niemeyer, which talks a little bit about how death of a loved one can sort of shatter some of our fundamental assumptions of life. And in grief process, we're trying to make sense, right, of something that doesn't make sense, trying to create a coherent narrative that kind of integrates our past, our present, and our future, and what the meaning of this loss has in our life now and moving forward. And so, so trying to really paying attention to the meaning-making perspective of not only just a loss, but the life of our loved one, and then what that means for our life now. Um, and and so that is kind of an area that sometimes folks can kind of work through as they're considering their grief journey. So after traumatic death, such as homicide by mass violence, there's sort of a dilemma in the field. It is very common to have all these kind of experiences and reactions, and we don't necessarily want to pathologize our grief journey and pathologize grief, because that is a very normal experience. But we also want to pay attention. Are we potentially neglecting something that could be addressed, something that we could potentially help people who might get stuck move through some of their grief? And so there's a little bit of a dilemma in the field around that. When we have the impact of traumatic bereavement, right? Somebody whose loved one has been killed, it increases, does increase our risk for things like depression, for post-traumatic stress disorder, and for prolonged grief. And folks who may not be familiar with prolonged grief, it is a newer diagnosis in the DSM. It was previously called persistent complex bereavement disorder. It's also been called complicated grief or complicated bereavement, and it all kind of means sort of the same thing. It is trying to define how some folks might get real stuck in that grief process, where they have intense yearning, they have a lot of thoughts and memories about their loved one, so much so that they really struggle kind of living life, that it disrupts their identity, it impacts their worldview. There's a lot of emotional pain, and also at the same time have some disbelief, and struggle with accepting that death and loss. And there's other symptoms that may go along with prolonged grief, but I want to highlight that there is some newer research out there that shows that there's a subgroup of individuals that might struggle with prolonged grief. Now, there's sort of this dual burden when it comes to mass violence and, death by homicide, is that you've got both the trauma nature of the type of death, and then you've got the grief component, the yearning and the loss of our loved one not being here. And that can be a big struggle for folks. It's the sudden, violent, volitional act with the dual burden of grief. And that can leave a lot of people really struggling, and making sure that seeking help to be able to work with, sometimes it's more the trauma nature that can be more prominent, sometimes it's the grief piece, sometimes it can be both. So just want to highlight a couple promising practices, as well as some early intervention that could be helpful for folks as they're working through their grief journey. First and foremost, social support is really important. We know that social support can add a buffer. It can help people feel understood, and they can be more informal support or more formal peer support groups that exist. And which I'll possibly talk about a little bit later. Social support, we know, lowers risk for complications, but that can be difficult with traumatic loss because of just the unique nature of this type of loss. But getting consistent, practical support can be really helpful. And then there is some literature that is showing promising practice of skills for psychological recovery as an early intervention. So helping people along that recovery, that natural recovery in their grief may be helpful for some individuals. And then if somebody does end up struggling with down the road with more trauma-related difficulties or grief-related difficulties, there are some evidence-based treatments and promising practices that do exist. This is not an exhaustive list, I want to clarify. It's just examples of ones that exist out there in the trauma and the grief field. So prolonged exposure, for example, for someone that might be struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder. Restorative retelling for violent death by Ted Rainerson kind of incorporates some of the both grief and trauma aspects. Grief approach is a modular based format. And then there's several child treatment treatments that exist out there that can work on both trauma and grief. And so I'm going to pause there. I think I just gave you all a whole lot of information to consider as we sort of set the stage for thinking about how to help ourselves and how to help other individuals who may be going through this type of traumatic grief journey.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. You laid the foundation for having this conversation today. And I was just thinking about when you were talking earlier, the reigniting of reactions that people can have as a result of having experienced this type of grief. And I was thinking about all of the other sorts of times that an incident of mass violence comes up. It can reignite those feelings and thoughts for folks. So it doesn't just go away.
Absolutely. It can bring up, so other mass violence incidents can bring up those trauma cues as well as those stug moments, right?
That's
Those
right.
grief cues as well, both the missing and yearningness, as well as the traumatic nature. Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Well, here is a wonderful introduction to a thing that we probably don't always talk about, but that's the vital role of funeral directors and morticians in working with homicide family survivors of loved ones killed in mass violence incidents. And this cannot be emphasized enough, the role of morticians and funeral directors. And I love it because our next speaker, I would never have assumed that she would have be a funeral director. And we have had a wonderful conversation around her getting into this field. And so, Vanessa, I want you to tell us more about the importance that your profession plays in helping families as they go through this traumatic experience.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Aurelia, for the introduction. First of all, it is an honor to be here with everyone today on the National Day of Remembrance for Murder Victims. This is a topic that is deeply personal for the funeral industry because when mass violence strikes, funeral directors stand at a unique crossroads in the communities that we serve. We are often the very first professionals that families encounter after a loss. And in these moments, we are more than providers of death care. We become first responders to grief. We become coordinators of complex systems and also guardians of memory. Families turn to us not because they must, but because they choose to do so. And that choice reflects trust. And with that trust comes an enormous amount of responsibility. And so let's begin with the heart of it. What makes us essential during moments of mass violence or homicide response? So, when mass violence occurs, the first question that a family faces is not only why, but who is going to help us get through this? And in those moments, funeral directors occupy a position that no other professional can fill. Families may be assigned victim advocates, they may be required to work with law enforcement, but they choose us. And that choice creates a foundation of trust. And it is in that foundation that comprehensive support and true collaboration begins. When tragedy strikes at 2 a.m. or on holidays, funeral directors, the funeral industry is there. We don't close and we don't delay. And that matters because in those first hours when shock is raw and it is overwhelming, we can offer not only immediate care, but we also provide guidance. Our role carries a kind of knowledge and competency that is both technical and cultural. Why? Because we stand to understand the sacred traditions and the diverse religious and ethnic needs of the communities that we serve. Often, just a simple gesture, a prayer, a burial custom means the difference between anguish and comfort to families in their most darkest moments. We are not only caretakers of the dead, we are also event planners for the surviving families. We create ceremonies that help balance the needs of grieving families with the needs of entire communities. We become part of a larger system of crisis response to help families in navigating their aftermath. Because it's very complicated. There are so many different levels that families now need to navigate as far as their grief and the initial moment of shock. And no single profession can meet all of the needs of the survivors. The scope is simply too vast. We're talking about medical, we're talking about legal, we're talking about emotional, spiritual, and financial needs. And that is why collaboration isn't just helpful, it is essential during these critical moments. We are in a unique position to serve families well. And when we partner closely with hospitals, with medical examiner facilities, with law enforcement agencies, and victim services, our position in crisis response comes together. Why? Because not only is it a privilege to serve families at their most devastating times, but it is also a profound responsibility. And these partnerships, they allow us to pretty much begin three very crucial steps. First, we can restore dignity to the victims through our collaboration with medical examiner facilities and hospitals. Second, we can foster trust and safety through our collaboration with law enforcement. And thirdly, we can ease financial and emotional burdens for families through our partnerships with victim services. These are just three examples, but they illustrate a larger truth. Effective crisis response is never the work of one professional alone. It is a network of care. All the hands that you see there are involved in one way or another in helping families through their grief. So, it is important to collaborate and to partner with other facilities. And normally, those partnerships become tested because interagency collaboration is a critical juncture. This process begins the moment we receive notification of a traumatic death. And from that very first moment, we don't operate in isolation. We immediately engage with multiple institutions. Why? Because the road to closure and healing begins with coordination. And in these first days, every detail is crucial. Our partnerships matter. Our partnerships with healthcare, law enforcement, victim services, religious and nonprofit organizations are all part of the bigger picture. And these partnerships form the backbone of crisis coordinated response. They are the first entities that funeral directors and survivors encounter in their journey. So how can we strengthen these relationships? We need clear communication protocols. We need standard procedures across all jurisdictions and specifically cross-training between every agency that touches a survivor's journey. Because if we learn from one another, we strengthen one another and we provide a more unified response. So let's touch briefly on where victim service integration comes in. So next slide, please. So when families come through our doors right after a mass violence event or after experiencing homicide, they are not just grieving. They are overwhelmed by financial stress, uncertainty, and also fear. And that is why our partnership with victim services is very crucial. The truth is, the funds are there. Federal and state programs exist to help families cover funeral costs, counseling, medical bills, relocation costs, and even lost wages. But families depend on funeral directors. They depend on us to know how to access and navigate those resources. They rely on us to help cut through the paperwork, the applications, the phone calls, the documents that need to be gathered, and we connect them with the support that they are going to immediately need. When we partner with these services, three very crucial things happen. One, we connect families to immediate financial relief. Here, for example, in New York City, Once I complete the crimes victim application form for the family, in a matter of 3 days, families can receive at least $3,000 in emergency funding to help begin the funeral process. And so we help not only families through this process, but we also help spare the pain of having to retell their trauma over and over and over again. This partnership works. But let's be honest, sometimes these services are not enough. We have too many survivors, too many families that are still falling through the cracks. And efforts, actions must be taken to advocate for better services, especially in rural and underprivileged areas. So let's touch base in some areas that require our immediate consideration. So we are talking about systems that are put in place to help victims, to help funeral directors connect families with the sources that we need. But some of these systems need extended support timelines. We need trauma-informed training, and we need prevention and advocacy so that communities can become stronger and more resilient after a mass violence event. It starts with recognizing that children, extended family members, and the community is significantly impacted. We need to create services that address the needs of the entire family, but also the needs of the community. Isolation, guilt, and loneliness are key emotions associated with this type of loss. So let's create spaces where survivors can find solace and they can find community to help them pick up the pieces. So for this reason, we cannot ignore our role as funeral directors in policy and prevention. Funeral directors, we see firsthand what families are going through. That perspective gives us a powerful voice. We can use our professional knowledge and our connections to build trusted relationships, not only with our families, but also for the systems that are there to help them. We need better services across multiple jurisdictions. We should support legislation requiring trauma-informed training for all death care professionals. Let's use our position in the community to support violence prevention. And let's help reduce the number of families that will require our need. So let's improve our services. If we strengthen these areas, we know not only give families the sources and the support that they need, but we also build a system that better supports the families of tomorrow. Coordination, training, and community engagement are very, very, very important. And as funeral directors, we use the National Funeral Directors Association and the Funeral Service Foundation as sources of information and guidance when these types of situations occur in our communities. When mass violence occurs, when we have homicide incidents that take place, the National Funeral Directors Association and the Funeral Service Foundation definitely give us a big helping hand. Why? Because when families walk through our doors after tragedy, they are overwhelmed and they are in shock, and they are also searching for direction and guidance. And without preparation and resources, we risk leaving families adrift at a very critical moment in their lives. That is why the National Funeral Directors Association and the Funeral Service Foundation have built a network of support that helps strengthen our professional responses. So I'm just going to go over 5 quick ways in which these foundations help us. So first, we have the Crime Victims Compensation and Advocacy. So the National Funeral Directors Association helps to train us and to give us tools and accredited courses that continue to expand our knowledge and our response to victim compensation. And not only does the National Funeral Directors Association do this for us, they are also very, very active advocates at the federal and state levels to help improve services needed not just for the funeral industry, but also for survivor response. Secondly, grief and trauma, when it comes to mass fatalities, they provide us with an enormous amount of education on how to respond to trauma cases, to mass fatalities, to embalming procedures that need to take place when we are dealing with mass casualties and with victims of the violence. And we also have certified trauma-informed care and mass violence protocols that are put in place, and these are sources that are very vital to us. Not just that, but the Funeral Service Foundation is able to deploy funds in as max as $50,000 when mass shootings occur. And this is to provide financial support and help for funeral homes and organizations in the community that might be dealing with these situations. And lastly, but very, very important, the NFDA promotes what it is the mental being of the funeral directors across the field, because serving families through violence also impacts us. And it impacts us at an emotional and also at a physical level. And so they provide wellness initiatives and peer networks so that we can process trauma and continue the work that we do. When we put these 5 support systems together, advocacy, grief resources, training, emergency relief, and wellness within the industry, we create a safety net. A net that holds not only the families that we serve, but also us as funeral professionals, so that we can stand prepared for when the moment arrives. So let's remember that behind every tragic headline, there are families that will walk through funeral home doors seeking answers, seeking compassion, and seeking guidance. And so, with the support of the National Funeral Directors Association and the Funeral Service Foundation, we are not powerless in the face of violence. We are equipped, we are supported, and we are united together so that we can ensure that even in the darkest moments, dignity, care, and healing remain within reach, not only to the survivors of homicide, to the survivors of mass violence, but also to the funeral directors who have to deal with these highly emotional situations on a regular basis. So I would like to take this moment to thank everyone for listening, and I would like to pass it on to the next speaker. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. That was great information. I'm certain that everyone is going to go home to find out how they can work closely with their funeral directors within their communities. And I just want to thank you also because I know your examples were from New York. And I want everyone to know that everything she said was based on New York, and it might be different in your community. Okay. Our next speaker, Dr. Burton, Howard Burton. I thank you so much for being with us today. Deborah and I have worked together for, I would say 30 years at least, Deborah. And we're fortunate to have her come and talk about trauma and death notifications and essential victim survivor services for families. Dr. Deborah Howard Burton.
Thank you so much. Thank you for each and every one of you who are here today. As you noticed, for the past half an hour or so, we've talked about grief and we talked about the funeral home. And now we're going to talk about how it all comes together with death and trauma notification. And the slide says, when a loved one dies in a mass violence incident, the profound impact reaches every corner of a person's life, leaving a lasting ripple effect that affects us all. And so when we do that, hold on, I'm just trying to move my slide so I can see it all. Hold on one moment. I'm having some technical difficulties. Thank you. It leaves a ripple effect. And so as you know, a ripple effect is when some it doesn't stay in one place. It expands, and that's what happens in a mass violence incident, that it expands, especially when it's unexpected. And so no one likes to give bad news. And when we talk about death notification or patients, notice one chant. Professionals who show compassion, empathy, patience, teamwork, cultural responsiveness, flexibility, being able to adapt, and who are trauma-informed and victim-centered. Those two things, trauma-informed, victim-centered, are best prepared to deliver these notifications. And I want us to think, because when we work in this field, we know at one time or another we're going to have to give death notification or trauma notification. And so what Dr. Beers came up with, these four trauma notification process. And this is what we're going to discuss a little bit about today. The first one that you would notice is planning. Now, we all think we're all planning at one time, but it is definitely important to plan. Now, remember, this is something that Dr. Beers came up that is being used now as to come in the field. So we have some type of way of some commonality when we as service providers deliver death notification, trauma notification. Now, understanding also that although these are the four peers of this, is that in your community and in your own agency, you'll have to adapt it. But these are something that is good for us to follow. So the first one is planning. Planning in planning stage, first of all, you have to make sure you have a team that's selected. You have to make sure you have know who the next of kin is, and you must know the details. It's nothing like being non-informed service providers going to give death notification or delivering not so good news to family members. So it's imperative that during this planning process that you have team members that match almost who you're going to discuss, and you also understand cultural considerations if that is significant to your case. You need to understand the details of what happened, how it happened. So my thing in my experience is, if you go in twos, because they suggest you go in twos, that you and your partner, the person that you're going with, that you all discuss how you're going to do the death notification before you get to the house, before you go there. Who's going to say what, even if you have to role play, that's very important in the planning stage. The next stage is preparation. Preparation is notice if you can find out, because you have to also understand in these mass violence incidents that a lot of times that is a crime scene. And so you're going to have to make sure that you go through your chain of command or law enforcement to understand what's going on as far as preparing. Notice who the next of kin is, understand what jurisdiction they are in or where they live. If there's any sensitivity, prepare yourself before you go. Planning, preparation, and now delivery. And probably delivery is probably the most part that, even as service providers, because we are human, that you can get a little emotional, and it is okay, because you're now going to give some type of news to someone who is not expecting it, unless, as we know now with social media, they've seen things on television, Facebook, social media, wherever it is along the world, it might be out there. And so now you need to go and prepare yourself to deliver this. And I always suggest if you can, your emotions in check as you get ready to go give this news to a family member. Of course, a lot of it is common sense, and common sense is not so common. But when you go to deliver notification, you also know that if you're coming to somebody's house, you have on a uniform, or you're in a marked unit or unmarked unit, if I'm looking out my window, I know it's not going to be good news. And so as you're preparing yourself, the knock on the door or whatever you have to do, of course, common sense is you introduce yourself along with your partner, who it is, and you ask if you can come in. Now, some cultures might say, no, you can't come in, and that's okay. But as long as you deliver the news, and one of the things we always say, and I've been taught, been doing this over 30 years, is that you give a single, precise message. I'm Deborah Burton. victim service provider, along with Officer John, and we are here to tell you some news about your son, John. Now, the first thing also you want to make sure when you do delivery, when you go to the house, you want to make sure that you're not telling the child. You want to make sure you have the right name. You want to make sure that you're talking to either the spouse or you're talking to a family member. And when you do tell them, never say, and this is something I've learned, never say loss or the body. Please, if you can, deliver the person and say it by their first name. John Smith, your son, died and has been identified and died during such and such and such and such. I am sorry. Nadi's passed away. Nadi's gone bye-bye. Nadi's gone here. It is so important in your delivery that you're can be as informative as you can. That's why in the planning stage, you have all the information that you can. And then at that time, people grieve differently. They might just be quiet. They might get emotional. And if you can, also in your preparation, I do want to say this. If you found out that maybe the person is taking blood pressure medicine or is on high blood pressure or they have some type of medical emergency, what I've done in my experiences is that I have called EMS and had them, or if it's not EMS where you are, or had an ambulance, maybe not on the same street, maybe down the street. So in case that person gets sick or emotional and needs some type of professional help, that I can call the paramedics to come and assist. And so those are some of the things that's very important when you give the delivery. Be as genuine as you can, because a lot of times they're going to have a lot of questions. Sometimes you can answer the questions, sometimes you cannot. And when I cannot overemphasize, don't try to make up anything. If you cannot answer the question, that's when you do the follow-up and tell them that I will get back with you tomorrow. I will tell you this, or I will get the information as quick as I can. And that comes with the follow-up. And even in your preparation, if you can, also offer, is there anybody I can call for you? Anything else I can do for you at this time? The next thing is follow-up. It's so important when you're delivering a notification that you do follow-up. If you can do it within the next 24 hours. And I know when you work in a mass violence incident and it's multi-victims, I know sometimes it's hard to do that, but at least if you can just make a phone call, they'll let the family know that, hey, I'm thinking about you. Your son, John, is important. I am following up on the information. Let me tell you how to make funeral arrangements. Let me tell you how it goes to the medical examiner. Let me tell you how law enforcement is pursuing this case. It's so important in follow-up that you give them the information they need. If you can, wherever place that you work, whatever organization you work, I do hope that you have a pamphlet or something that you can pass out to the families as part of your follow-up. This is procedure, this is what's happened, this is victims' compensation, this is what the funeral home does, this is what the medical examiner does, because a lot of people only experience death either by personally, but a lot of people don't experience by a mass violence incident or somebody being murdered, and at that time, they're emotional, and some people only see death notification as it's done on television. They think it's solved like that. So it's so important as victim service providers and those of you who work in this field, when you get death notification or trauma notification, that you follow these 4 steps that Dr. Tracy Beers has come up with that will help you facilitate this process. And as we go from here, we also want to know that when we deliver death notification, we become the bridge. We almost become the anchor to families or family members or survivors, because victims of mass violence incidents require not only immediate crisis intervention, but also a comprehensive long-term support services that address the multifaceted layers of trauma, disruption, and grief that they endure. Advocates play a crucial role in serving as a vital connection to those essential resources, thereby reducing the likelihood of re-traumatization. And that's one thing that we want to try to do as we bridge the services together. We want to make sure that we do not re-traumatize the family and the victims again, because it's so easy to do that when we're not sensitive. Therefore, the way that we bridge things together is providing these services. And these are some of the services I'm quite sure that some of you have offered as you work with victims and mass violences or even homicide victims. And the first one is we want to assist and advocate. We're not here to become their lawyers. We're here to advocate. And advocate, we want to make sure that they understand the process of what's going on. We want to advocate to make sure that their rights, the rights that the family member has, we want to make sure that we're doing the best we can to advocate on their behalf and assist them with the paperwork. Mental health and emotional support. We will also want to make sure to let them know that, do you need counseling? Do you need crisis counseling? Because most of a crisis counselor. Do you need to go to someone further? These are important steps that you're not going crazy. These are definitely trauma reactions that you go through, that you're not crazy, and it's okay. We want to also make sure the legal service and the criminal justice system support. If you need to go to court with them, you go to court. I know in some agencies you might not be able to go to court, but at least link them with someone in the justice system that can help them. In other words, if your agency doesn't do it, then you need to contact someone within the criminal justice system and say, I have a Deborah that's coming here. I want to make sure that she's going to this hearing. Can your agency make sure that she's there and everything's all right? You want to also help them with practical and daily living services. You might have to help them with school. You might have to help them with their work. You might have to help them with filling out paperwork for Social Security. These are things that sometimes we take for granted, but some people don't know about. Community and spiritual services. Especially if it happened in the community. You might have to do a debriefing or get an organization to come in and do a debriefing on what has happened in the community. You want to make sure that you have spiritual advisors, rabbis or chaplains or priests along that who are trained in the area of mass violence incidents to come in and be that filler to sometimes answer questions of why this happened. Why did God allow this to happen? You have to understand some of the rituals that might go on in that community. And last but not least, as we bridge the gap, we want to make sure that they understand this is a long-term process to healing and recovery. Some people think that I'm going to be better in 2 days and 3 days and go back on in life. It's essential for victim service providers to make sure that we hand out, no, this is a process. This is the guidelines. Understanding that these are just guidelines does not mean this is definitely how it's going to happen on your healing and recovering process. And so as we bridge the gap together with that, we have to understand that what makes a mass violence incident so different than anything else, that you might have multi-families. Mass violence incidents often have a unique and compound effort on multi-families and extended family members. These family members may face layers of trauma, financial strains, and challenges navigating the services. Advocates and service providers must consider these factors to ensure the provision of effective trauma-informed and family-centered support. This is definitely important. When there's a mass violence incident, especially let's say it happened at a daycare, you don't know if the teacher is working there and also if maybe her children are going there and someone comes in and shoots up the building. You don't know if a mass violence incident happened at Walmart and the shooter comes in and kills the mother, kills the father, but the child survives. And so when you look at it from that perspective, then you have a lot of unique compounding effects that it will have. And some of the effects that it will have on a family is, one, emotional and psychological support. In a multi-family household, you have a large family network, meaning one or more individuals are going to be affected by this. And so when you get that, then you also know that different members of the family will grieve differently. The father might say, I'm doing fine. The mother might say, I'm not doing fine. The grandmother might say, I don't know what's going on. And as a service provider, when we go and try to assist the family, we have to make sure that we understand that everybody grieves different. Therefore, when we offer mental health counseling and mental health support, that we have to understand that sometimes you cannot do it collectively. You might have to have different members of the family go to different service providers to get emotional and psychological assistance because it will affect people differently. Another thing is service challenges, navigating the challenges. Multifamily members may require service at the same time, and some of them might require services at a different time. And what happens is, can you imagine that it is overwhelming? I have to go see this person. I have to go to Social Security. Now I have to go in and find out if I'm going to get extra money for this. Sometimes it can be overwhelming when you have so many things happening at one time. And when that happens, it can be a challenge. And victim advocates must be family oriented and centered to understand how we have to make sure that each of the members of the family get the support that they need. Another instance is financial and housing. Sometimes a loss of income due to a death can ripple effect on a lot of people. Now, maybe some of you watching, we might have two jobs, and if something happens, you might have insurance, you might have a 401k, might have money set up, but a lot of times people are not fortunate as that. And so when you have a family member who's been a victim of a mass violence tragedy, and they were the sole breadwinner. Now what happens? How do I get finances? Who's going to pay my mortgage? And so it's going to be important that as service providers that we kind of understand that. Do they need funeral support? Do they need assistance with food? Do they need rental assistance? Do they need emergency housing? These are some of the things that makes this a little bit more complicated than a regular homicide, because now we have to help the whole family in a state that has been affected by this incident. The next thing is cultural and community considerations. When there's a multifamily household from immigration, minority, or close-knit culture community, the extended family goes well beyond the last name. That's so important because a lot of times we think of, especially in some cultures, we think of just blood relatives, but in some cultures, it's not blood relatives. My aunt could be my neighbor. My uncle could be my mother's best friend. And so when a mass violence incident occurred, it not only affects the core member of the family, but it also affects the extended family. So it's so important that you have that in consideration, especially if it's faith-based. And so if it touches one part of the Christian community or Jewish community or Muslim community, it's going to affect others within that community who might not even been part of that community. And it's very important for you to understand that. Impact also is long-term recovery. Long-term recovery needs. Survivors of mass violence households struggle to rebuild and struggle to gain a new sense of, and I hate to use this word, new sense of normalcy, because nothing becomes normal when it's a mass violence incident, or if you're a victim or survivor, nothing becomes normal. Now I just have to find another way of how to get through this, especially if everybody's living in the same neighborhood. How does it become normal? Now we have to deal with the concerns, the safety. Every time I hear, and I'm glad my colleague spoke about this, every time I hear something, is it going to pull me back onto the day that this happened? If I see something on TV of a shooting, if I see something, somebody was shot here, this is going to be a long-term recovery. And it's so important that we explain this to families of a multifamily victims and survivors, that we explain this along the way. And last but not least, we have to understand that mass violence incidents, you could have some international victims. And so it's important that in your planning stage above this, that you have to understand, where's the embassy? You might have to help them with passports. You might have to call the embassy. You might have to understand that sometimes some of the survivors' families might want to have their loved ones' bodies sent back to their native country. So those are some of the things that make this so complex, that we definitely have to be the bridge when it comes over to assisting mass violence victims. And it's so important that even as we go through the emotional impact, the navigating challenges and financial and housing and cultural considerations and international victims, it's so important that we learn how to do things. Next slide, please. We learn how to do things in a way that honors victims. Because when we don't honor the victims or the family, it's like they're dust and they're not here. So it's so important that as mass violence victims and survivors must be involved, and this is very important, in a leadership role during all planning process. In a leadership role in all planning process. Their voices and their choices form the basis for a memorial that honors them and their loved ones. Because when you do that, it's a sense of empowerment. It's a sense of, thank you so much, that I want to let you know how my father or my mother can be remembered. Thank you so much for thinking about me, that after the situation has happened, that you still think of me enough that I want to decide how's a way to involve the memory of my loved one. And when we ask and not tell them what we want to do, it makes appointment, and it's so important, and it bridges the gap to being informed, being compassionate, and having empathy. Because it's one thing we never want to say is we don't want to tell people, I know how you feel, because you don't know how you feel. We might have similar circumstances, but you never know how you feel. Because the way we, when I say we as social service providers, law enforcement, funeral home directors, and those who come in contact with mass violence victims, the way we deliver death and trauma notification can be profoundly shape the resilience and the healing journey of family members. And I think that is just awesome, that when we deliver it this way, that we can be the catalyst, we can be the bridge that helps shape them to understand that this right here is hard, but I'm going to walk you every step of the way to let you understand that I care. And last but not least, in the face of loss, we all rise by lifting others. Justice begins with compassion. Thank you so much for listening to my part of this presentation.
Thank you so much, Deborah. There's so much, and I think that we're seeing that there's just so much that all of our presenters are so passionate about. But now I've got to push us because we're running into the very end of our time together. And I want to just highlight a couple areas. First of all, to honor the legacy of victims killed in incidents of mass violence. You see here before you a way that the memorial that was set up by the 9/11 Memorial and Museum located in New York City honors their victims, and through their setup here, and it was created under the leadership of Voices Center for Resilience, that was co-founded and is led by Mary Fetchett, who is a member of the Mass Violence Center's Survivors and Providers Steering Committee. Beautiful, beautiful exhibit. If you have not been to New York and if you've not seen it, I hope that you will do that. I want to ask our presenters just very, very quickly if they will talk about a way that they have, through their experience, very quickly honored victims of homicide. Alyssa, if you'll start first for us, please?
Sure. So, in the aftermath of mass violence or homicide, right, trying to make sense of what happened can be a challenge. And so, but we do have the ability to find purpose in our present life. So we can focus on creating meaning instead of trying to make sense. Maybe we make meaning by building that into our present day. And that can be shaped with connection with or an honor of those that have been killed. And so figuring out ways, and everybody's different in how they choose to live life with meaning and purpose, and how they do that, carrying forward and honoring their loved one could look different from person to person. For somebody, it's as simple as I'm going to drink water in honor of my sister who, was a big health nut. Or it could be bigger things like getting involved in advocacy in the work in is it maybe how they because of how they died, or maybe things that they were involved and invested in. So finding meaning in connection and honor can perhaps be of use.
I love that. Purpose, connection, and honor. Thank you. Vanessa.
I would say for myself as a funeral director, I try to shift the narrative from seeing the individual solely as a victim, to remembering them for the legacy that they will be leaving behind, to creating photo montages, music playlists, and video tributes that reflect those personal things that the individual liked and enjoyed, those moments that they shared with their friends and family that are meaningful and that will be lasting memories. So shifting the narrative from seeing the individual solely as a victim to highlighting the goodness and the light that they brought to the world, I feel is a wonderful, wonderful way to honor the legacy of those individuals that we lose in traumatic waves.
I love that. Shifting the narrative. Dr. Deborah, will you talk to us, please? Ways
Yes.
you've honored? Mm-hmm.
Thank you. One of the things that has been done in Broward County is called a Garden of Reflections. And what it does is every year during Victims' Rights Week, there's a wall of reflection that if a family member would like to, they have the name engraved on the wall. And so every year the community comes out, and that's how they are honored.
Very good. Very good. One of the things that we've learned, and we hear you when you talk to us, early on in our National Town Hall series, the attendees said to us that they appreciated the knowledge that they gained, but they also wanted something that was very practical. What is a takeaway or a skill from our town hall? So I'm going to ask each of you if you would give us a specific strategy or skill that the attendees can take away today. So, Alyssa, I'm going to begin with you again, please.
Sure. So traumatic grief is distinct, right, from bereavement, other types of bereavement. And so it might require special type of counseling that address both the trauma and the grief that's associated with that type of death. And so, to clarify, not everybody might need counseling. Grief is natural, it's universal, but it's also a complex experience. And so if somebody is really struggling with living, it could be helpful to connect with a trauma and grief trained provider, either early on to foster that grief journey, or later if struggling, someone is still struggling and suffering. So really connecting with some of those specialized services can be helpful.
Very good. Vanessa.
I would say, as a funeral director, the best advice, the best strategy that I can give to listeners is don't be afraid of the funeral home. Don't be afraid of the funeral director. We are a fountain of knowledge. We are in our communities to serve. And so when these incidents occur, when we are struggling with grief, when we are struggling with these situations that go way beyond us and we don't know where to start, think of your local funeral home, think of your funeral director as a source of knowledge and guidance, because that is what we are here for. We are here to guide our communities through some of the most difficult events that they have to go through in their lives. So just trust us, and don't be afraid to walk in and ask us for help.
Thank you. That's good advice. Deborah.
Hi, I would say as service providers, we need to make sure that we offer support that is both coordinated and compassionate and prepared when we're sharing or giving death notification.
Very good. We had some questions that came in, and what we tried to do was kind of consolidate them into different brackets. And so, Alyssa, let me start with you, if you don't mind. How can we do better to assist homicide family survivors in rural, remote, tribal, and frontier communities?
I think that's a hard question.
That's a big question.
I do think definitely developing coordinated plans is really, really essential, particularly if we're thinking about those that reside in rural, remote, tribal, frontier communities. Those plans need to be often sometimes not only local, but at a regional and a state level to be able to better support individuals in those communities that might have less resources. So proactively approaching, thinking about identifying gaps in those communities where access to perhaps trained professionals and trauma and grief might not be available, and and coming up with a plan that folks can come in and support. But making sure as we're developing those plans that individuals from those communities are part of that planning. They need to be representatives at the table to talk about community needs. But we could potentially leverage telehealth services on a statewide level. We can build relationships perhaps between local communities before crisis occurs. And that's really important to establish trust and to make sure people then can connect to resources. So just to give it a little bit of example, through our collaboration with the National Governors Association, they've worked with us on a learning collaborative with several different states right now to help explore how state and regional partnerships can be more effective to try to meet the needs and better understand the needs of communities in sort of remote, rural, tribal communities after mass violence. So planning is really important.
Thank you so much. That's very good. And even though mass violence incident might not occur in a rural area, and they do occur, we have had them, but people in that community have to go home to those communities. So I thank you for mentioning telehealth. That's wonderful. Deborah, let me ask you this. What are some of the chaplains? What is their role in assisting and supporting family members?
A chaplain role is very important if you're on your faith and spiritual. I think that chaplains have to be careful if they're not trained in trauma, if they're not trained on how to handle mass violence incident survivors or family members. They have to be careful because they never want their faith to circumvent the faith of the family. And so chaplains are very good. I think they need to work together with victim service providers, but I think they also need to be trained in this field and understand that everybody doesn't share the same faith. So they have to make sure that they're fluid and understand that if they are Christian, you don't push your values on another person who might not share your same belief and vice versa. I just think they just need to definitely be trained in trauma, victim services, and then put it all together when they come out.
Very good. Thank you. Our last question, Vanessa, goes to you. And how can we help survivors strengthen their support networks, including families and marriages?
Okay. I would say that first of all, services need to be redesigned using a family system approach, an approach that involves treating the loss not just as an individual tragedy, but one that affects the entire family system. We need to recognize that children, spouses, extended family members, they are significantly impacted by mass violence or by a homicide event. And this approach is to counter a fragmented sort of care that sometimes leaves families kind of struggling with complex and lasting emotions within the family nucleus. I have family members, for example, the husband is struggling with guilt. The spouse is struggling with hiding her fear and hiding her emotions because she now needs to make sure that her family is taken care of. And then if you have children that have been impacted, they have just lost their best friend, their hero, that person that provides them that support as an older brother and an older sister. So we definitely need to provide services for the whole entire family unit, because we all know that after mass violence, after homicide incidents, the levels of stress and the community, I mean, I'm sorry, the communication between the family unit can be fragmented. And then they can just isolate themselves, thinking that they need to go through this alone. So we need to definitely provide services that address the grief and address the emotions as a family unit for sure.
Very good. Thank you so much. Well, as always, we have so many things that we wanted to talk about, some other issues that we wanted to get into, but we're not going to be able to get into that today. I would just want to say, if you have any consultation, training, or technical assistance needs that are relevant to mass violence preparation, response, recovery, or resilience that our center can help fulfill, please email us using the addresses on this slide to reach out to us. We'll be happy to respond to you and get you the information that you need. As we come to an end of this National Town Hall, we rely on your evaluations, the information that you feed back to us to help us improve our training and our technical assistance. When we close this session, a brief survey will appear on your screen. Please take a few minutes to fill it out. It's not long, and we will appreciate hearing from you and learning your input. For those of you who plan ahead, our next National Mass Violence Center Town Hall will be number 16, and it's scheduled for Thursday, February 26, 26, a whole another year. In your evaluation, please send us topics that you would like to see addressed in our 2026 rotation of National Town Hall series. We thank you so much for being a part of this experience today, and we look forward to having you come back with us and sharing with us. Remember today as the 2025 National Day of Remembrance for Murder Victims, honoring those persons whose lives were taken in homicide. Thank you so much again for joining us and being a part of this. Thank you to our panel and everyone behind the scene. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.